All right, so hello everybody. Welcome to our Cosplay for Science panel. Let's try that again. I was kidding.
Yeah, we can try it again.
Okay. Hi everybody. Welcome to our Cosplay for Science panel.
Woo! Yay!
Never mind. Anyway, so we are Cosplay for Science. We are a group of scientists, cosplayers, and educators who love combining all of those things to share amazing stories in science with everybody who is into science fiction, fantasy, all things nerdy and fandom. I'm really excited because we've got our amazing team up here to talk about what we do in Cosplay for Science and kind of the importance of bringing science communication and education to a place like LA Comic-Con. So why don't we start by introducing ourselves as we go down the line, kind of say who you are, what you do, and who's your favorite fictional scientist? How about that? Sound good? All right.
We start from the other end.
All right, fine. We'll start with Sarah.
Hello, I'm Sarah White. I'm a science communicator working for a university, and I'm also a PhD candidate in learning science. So I study teaching and learning, which is a wonderful combination of the things that I enjoy most. And my favorite scientist, fictional scientist, is Princess Shuri from Marvel's Black Panther and Wakanda Forever.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Kellen Kartub. I have my PhD in chemistry, and I work in industry now, actually, as a chemist for Bear Paint. So I'm in R&D, study paint. There's a fair amount of chemistry behind it. I have been involved with Cosplay for Science for a handful of years. I just love communicating science so much, regardless of, what I am doing otherwise. And my favorite scientist is probably Princess Bubblegum, actually, from Adventure Time. She's a leader, she is a crazy scientist, dabbles in a lot of chemistry, so yeah. And she wears a lot of pink. Love it.
And I'm Dr. Lisa Lundgren. I am a professor at Utah State University in our Department of Instructional Technology and Learning Sciences. So just like Sarah, I study how people learn about, I learn about learning, and then I specifically focus on how people learn about science in places like Comic-Con. And my favorite fictional scientist is Dr. Ellie Sattler from Jurassic Park.
Very nice.
Hi everybody, my name is Brittney Stoneburg. I'm a vertebrate paleontologist and I work for the Western Science Center. I'm the collections manager there, and we're also here at Comic-Con, so if you want to go see our big museum trailer, we're over in the other exhibit hall, just down the hallway. I'm also a co-founder of Cosplay for Science. Gabe and I have worked together for a number of years, and at the risk of copying Lisa here, my favorite scientist is also Dr. Ellie Sattler. I'm predictable.
Hello, friends. My name is Bailey Jorgensen. I'm the collections manager at the ALF Museum, and I've done dozens of these events by now with Cosplay for Science just as a booth jockey, and my favorite fictional scientist is Dr. Morton Solis from Mass Effect.
That's also a good one.
Oh, now I don't know who to choose.
Yeah, Fred.
Okay, so my name is Gabriel Santos. I am a paleontologist or an educator. I'm currently the Director of Education and Visitor Engagement at the ALF Museum of Paleontology. I'm also the co-founder of Cosplay for Science along with Brittney. We decided we were going to go to a con, or if we're going to go to a con, we should dress up, and it turned out to something much bigger than we ever imagined.
Whoops.
I'm also a Grosvenor Teacher Fellow with National Geographic and Limbo Expeditions, where I get to learn how to use storytelling for education, and that's exactly what we love to do at Cosplay for Science. Oh yeah, my favorite fictional scientist, okay, this is going to be a little bit controversial, but one of my favorite superheroes is Ant-Man and Hank Pym. I know he's very problematic. I absolutely know that. But reading Ant-Man and knowing about Hank Pym and the Silver and Golden Age comic book stuff, he really inspired me to be like, a scientist could be a superhero? No way, that's so cool. So that's why Ant-Man, Hank Pym, Giant Man, all of them, my favorite fictional scientists.
Not Professor Oak.
Ant-Man was before Professor Oak.
Okay.
Also, I don't know, Professor Oak's a little shady sometimes.
I don't know what he's up to.
Anyway, so how about we get started? Let's explain what Cosplay for Science is when I say that to all of you. What does it mean when we do Cosplay for Science? Anybody?
Can you repeat the question?
When I say Cosplay for Science, what does that mean to you?
To me, it means we're trying to engage, like when we're coming to Comic-Con, a lot of people here are also in cosplay, so we're showing that we're part of the community, but that we also have a nerdy side too, and that there's a lot of people here. We're trying to find our people as well and show people that they can embrace both the science and the fiction of all of their favorite comics and media properties, but it's using cosplaying or costuming, because I'm more in like the Disney bounding community, which is usually like regular people clothes rather than trying to look exactly like another character, but being part of those communities and then using that membership to share our love of science and hopefully get people excited about it at the same time.
For me, I like Cosplay for Science because it sort of strives to make science more inclusive in a way, because you show up to a place, like a lot of scientists are inspired by these sort of fictional worlds, but a lot of people that enjoy the fictional worlds can't see themselves in science, so it helps sort of to bridge that gap, to realize that anyone can be a scientist.
And I think also it's meeting people where they are. I think traditionally when science organizations think about events and outreach, going to places to talk about science, a lot of times they think about going to places that are already focused on science. This gives us an opportunity to meet people who may in their day-to-day not have what they think is like an interaction with science or scientists very often. So we're bringing the science to them rather than expecting them to try and find us.
I think something that you all made me think of is like, when I'm a scientist, I don't wear a lab coat, like in my day job or when I'm working on my research, but a lot of scientists, or a lot of people, that's what their traditional conception of scientists are, is people wearing lab coats and being in a lab, and maybe that they only care about science, and we're trying to show that scientists can look like anything and wear anything, and maybe wear, I don't know, they can wear whole mecha suits or like anime costumes and all sorts of things, and not just be in a lab and show the stereotypical side of being a scientist.
Which of you has a mecha suit? I want one.
I want one.
That does bring up a good point, because there's also the aspect of how everyone already engages with science. So right, if you're building your own mecha suit, you know, there's a heavy amount of design and engineering in that. There's a lot of decision making in what materials you select when you're creating, you know, anything from your dress or like your armor. So there's also this aspect where we could even kind of show people how the work they do, the cosplay they do, or even the characters they choose, like you're already engaging in science in a fun way. So yeah, there's many aspects to Cosplay for Science.
Lisa.
I feel like everyone kind of said what I think about when I think about Cosplay for Science. I really like this idea of meeting people where they are, and trying to understand that not all science, like Sarah said, has to happen in a lab, and you meet people where they are and what their interests are, like Brittney said. And so it, to me, is just a way of showing that a scientist isn't one-dimensional. And so the cosplay aspect is a way of saying, hey, we have interests that are the same as your interests, and we really want to talk with you about the things that you love and that we love too.
Awesome. Yeah, no, for me, I really think it's a lot about building trust too with audiences. There's a lot of mistrust out there for scientists for many, many reasons. And when they engage with us, you know, whether we're at a pop-up museum or we're here on a panel, again, like you've all said, they get to see us as someone, they can see us as a person. They can see something that they can connect with us on a personal level. And we're not just those scientists with the weird perception that we're in a lab, we're guarding secrets, you know, we're we're those folks who think we're better than everybody else. You know, we're just regular people. We've just spent a long time studying like one particular thing, but we have the same interests, we have the same faults, we share our love of comics and video games, movies, and cosplay, and it's just fun stuff. And we're approachable, I think.
Don't we look so approachable? Promise we're not all secret super villains.
Why'd you look at me?
I said not all of us.
Okay, so I think one other question that I think some people think about us when we say we're part of Cosplay for Science and we go to Comic-Cons, is there really that much science and pop culture and fiction and things like that? What's your opinions? Do we belong here?
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, our answer is definitely yes. And I mean, I don't know if we want to like give examples or anything like that. But like the reason that I even found Cosplay for Science was because I was tired of only focusing on my one specific area of science, and like I want to learn about all the other science that's cool and exists in the world, whether it's in chemistry or biology, and that's not what I was like focused on all the time. And I was just trying to find people that would communicate about it and to share it. And I was like, oh, I could think about how like princesses could go and get their PhDs, and if they were going to be princesses, what would they study? And then that just kind of turned into a big thing, like, oh, what is all of the science in Sleeping Beauty, and like what would cause someone to be in a coma-like state for 100 years, and like is there anything realistic about that in our real world? And that's just a whole rabbit hole into like Disney parks, and that's a big part of my fandom. And like, how do we make roller coasters? How do we make all of these illusions that seem magical but use science and technology to do it? So those are just some of my favorite examples of how STEM is in all of our favorite fictional ideas.
Yeah, and I think there's this misconception with science, that science is separate from our daily lives, that it is not a thing that, unless you are a scientist or have some other association with it, it's not something that you engage with. But we engage with science every single day. If you boil a pot of water to make your coffee in the morning, you're engaging with science. And so I think Cosplay for Science really just shows like, hey, everything, every movie, every video game, every piece of like cultural like media property has some way to engage with science, because science is not like this separate discipline that only some people are interacting with. It's a part of everybody's day, every day. And so it's really just recognizing that science is a process, it's a way of thinking about the world, and that it is reflected in all of our favorite media.
I think anyone who's done any sort of creating too, in like the creative spheres for movies, books, TV, whatever, recognizes that creature design, planet design, world design, all of that comes from somewhere. And so we've worked with, at the Alpha Museum and its Cosplay for Science, with animators, with illustrators, with creators who look at fossils, who look at animals, who look at planetary systems to design their fictional worlds, which I think is a thing that a lot of people are interested in when they approach the booth and talk to us about things. Is if your passion in coming to Comic-Con is sort of the creative fictional things that we celebrate here, the roots of that, those came from a lot of science, which is really fun to explore.
I'll just add that, I mean, even though there's fiction in the name, it's still science fiction, and right, I mean, just tons of science there. But I will make an argument for the fantasy side of things. Actually, since I study chemistry, actually one of the closest things I can usually compare it to are fantasy worlds and would be magic systems. So, you know, for example, a favorite magic system of mine is Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn, and it's all based around metals, and I studied metals for my PhD, so there are many connections that can be made between the metals that they use and what kind of magic that allows them. Or another, I don't know if you call it a magic system or just world building, would be that of Avatar: The Last Airbender. All these elements, they don't just appear out of nowhere. There are physical rules that govern them, and you know, we can discuss how, you know, when firebenders create fire, are they able to, you know, create, like sustain that combustion reaction? So you can compare and contrast science to the fiction that we see, and it's fun if it's the same, and it's fun if it's totally different. It's all fun.
And I think it can be, so like, the idea of Mistborn is really fun, and because it is so based in science, right? Like that's a magic system that you can feel makes sense. Like if you know even a little bit about chemistry, you're like, oh, okay, it makes sense that you have to draw these metals in order to create this kind of power. And then you look at maybe a magic system that wasn't as based in science or well designed, like Harry Potter, and you say, what is happening here, and why does anything happen? Like, why does the system exist in any sort of sense? And it just feels, to me, more, when you have something that's more grounded in reality of like metals, you use metals to do this power, it's like, oh, that makes so much sense. So, I don't know, I love that. I love that idea of like, yeah, things that are based in reality have a little bit more weight for me.
Kellen, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't your PhD basically alchemy? Weren't you trying to turn things into gold?
No, but
Okay.
I did work with gold.
Okay.
Tried to use it for useful ways. Although I would create gold nanoparticles, but you know, I had like the gold salt phase.
Oh, okay.
I didn't make it out of nothing.
Can I add something? Of like, even like of why we belong here, that I feel like fans, even if they're not scientists, are constantly questioning their films and their media, and like even if you're trying to think about, oh, what about this plot hole, or like in Star Wars, if you have a ship collide with another ship and there's no sound, that's like, then that's a surprise, and why is that? And just comparing that and comparing the artist's decisions to like, why did they make that decision? And a lot of those decisions actually can earn Academy Awards too. There's actually Academy Awards for innovation in science and technology, and not just for cinematography and directing and all of those kinds of things. So I feel like art and science are just always going to be intertwined, so why not celebrate that?
I think too, one thing that folks don't realize is that they are doing science in, you know, when they're doing critical thinking, when they're playing video games and like, because they're asking questions in the right setting. One of my favorite things that I ever heard was from an amazing science communicator, Deanne Lee, on Twitter. She said that our audiences already have the lexicon of these science words and concepts in their head, but they don't have the connection to the real world. They understand it from the world of fiction and fantasy. And when we come here, we get to help bridge that connection. We can be the avatars of Comic-Con to bridge the two worlds. And I think it's really cool because, again, like, everyone has that capability, that potential for scientific thought, right? It's just getting them to transfer it from asking something like, well, how does, why is a starship able to use hyperspace, to, okay, so how can we do interstellar travel, right, in our world? And again, it's bridging the connections between the words and concepts they know to how it works and exists in our world. I mean, like, if we look at Pokemon, right? Pokemon is literally being a naturalist, for the most part, except for the fighting thing. But it's like, they go out, they collect specimens, and they have their Pokedex, which is gathering data on them. You're basically doing the work of a naturalist, but folks don't realize it. The words are different because they're a Pokemon trainer and things like that.
I did recently see someone on the internet, unfortunately I don't recall off the top of my head the attribution, but I saw somebody on the internet say, Pokemon is basically just birding. Like, that's what it is.
And sometimes they fight.
And sometimes they fight.
Let them fight.
But I think some of that language, like Pokemon Trainer, is an effective aspect of the storytelling and that world building, and trying to do that translating between the world building that we use in science and the language that we use in science, and to tell stories about who we are as scientists and what we do. If people don't understand what we're doing, that we can do the same thing, and we have our own hero's journey as scientists. We have our own goals and aspirations and obstacles and challenges and maybe enemies too, villains in our world, just like characters in your favorite media do. But we want to show, like, hey, that we can use that same language that they're familiar with and tell the stories and the words and story beats that they're.
I gotta start making enemies.
I mean, you know, that's what I'm lacking. I need a nemesis.
A rival.
Well, I mean, like, coming back on talking about like the words and things like that people see, there's also this strange perception of how science and scientists are portrayed in a lot of fiction, right? There's the mad scientist trope. There's many times the scientist is portrayed as the protagonist, or they're like the quote crazy scientist that nobody will listen to. And they're also portrayed as, you know, these people who lock themselves away in a lab, or in the case of Lake Placid, the paleontologist who doesn't do field work and hates going out in the field. I'm like, okay. Like, I'm not big into field work. I'm not big into field work, but I've done it and I liked it when I was there. I choose not to go if I'm not have to. Okay, whatever. Anyway, do you think we can help change perceptions of scientists? Excluding me.
I definitely think so. And I think the one portrayal that I always see on screen and in books that feels especially accurate is the idea of like the lone scientist, like the lone genius who's like, I know everything and I alone can fix this world-ending problem. Like, no, like every paper I've ever been on has had like 6 or 7 people on it. Science is a collaborative effort. You very rarely have like a lone genius, and those people are often jerks. So science is really meant to be an interaction between people, because you need different perspectives to be able to ask questions. And so I think showing that, explaining to people like, hey, pretty much no scientist works completely alone. We have to work together in order to solve some of these big issues in our world, is something that we can definitely fight against. Because that's the one trope where I'm like, no, that's not right. Why is it always like this?
Okay, this one's actually a big one for me. So when picking cosplay, you know, sometimes it's like, I'm a chemist, it would be great to pick chemists. I can't tell you how many of those chemists are villains or it's slim pickings. So I often, when you ask like, who's your favorite scientist? I'm like, cool, who do I want to say? Do I want to say Princess Bubblegum? She kind of falls into the mad scientist trope, but she's also a leader and she's pretty great. And her stuff is mad, but relatively harmless. And oh my gosh, I'm like totally Honey from
Honey Lemon.
Yes, Honey Lemon. Thank you. I was like,
yeah.
it's not Honey Bee. Honey Lemon from Big Hero 6. Those are pretty much my 2 options as chemists who are women who aren't evil. Because there are other women chemists, but they're usually evil. I prefer to stick to like heroes. But right, so yeah, no, I don't know. Scientists, right? They usually get locked into this role, and I think yes, you know, showing that scientists aren't all evil. We're not out there creating diseases or bad things. Actually, a lot of people are trying to create cures and use their science to make things better. So yes, I strongly support this in that aspect of raising, you know, the public's opinion of scientists.
One of my favorite tweets, well, I also don't remember who tweeted it, but it's like, there's so many superhero villains that are chemists, and like people who aren't scientists are like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. They got their PhD and they're going to be an evil scientist. And then people with PhDs are like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense because getting a PhD is awful and it would make me want to be an evil villain. I feel that, you know, a little bit, not trying to be a villain, but I relate. And so like showing maybe we never see, I think, supervillains in the process of getting their training. We just assume they're super geniuses. Sometimes they're super young, and it just makes it seem really easy for them. And I don't think we show the struggles of science and getting to the point of like maybe actually having people listen to your science and what you're trying to share about the new knowledge that you're making. And the challenges of that sometimes. But I think sometimes the perception that, oh, people aren't listening to scientists, that happens, but that's why we're trying to change it as well and say, okay, we're not going to just write about our research in an academic paper with really fancy language that most people don't know how to get to or can't get to because it's hundreds of dollars to get the paper, and it's in language that it's only meant for other chemists or something like that. And we're trying to be like, okay, let's talk about our science in everyday language, and that scientists can talk like that, and don't only use fancy language, and maybe they shouldn't.
Well said all around.
You know, like talking about cosplay for science, we're also, you know, we're very much about education. And I think this is specific for our educators on the panel. We think of education as being in a classroom, right? We think of us going to school, college. There's very specific perceptions of where education can happen. But when we come here to a Comic-Con, like, how do we change that perception of like, you can learn, not just in a classroom, but I think it's also changed perception that like, you can learn anywhere. You're always learning, but it's like, you know, specifically for people who are like, I'm not good at school, I'm not good at specific subjects, and how do we help bridge their gap, or bridge that gap to folks who just don't feel like that they belong or have a science mind, and, you know, show them that you can learn other places?
That's a really good question. I think part of it for me is there's been research that shows that almost the majority of your learning, like between 90 and 95% of learning takes place out of school, like throughout your lifetime, right? Because think about it, you're only in school, normal people are only in school until about 12th grade, and sometimes you go to college, but that's still only 16 years of like a, 80 or 90 year lifespan. And so being able to say, if you watch television shows, if you listen to podcasts, if you watch any science fiction, there's something about science in there. And so I think I like this idea of changing the perception of what's learning, because I think a lot of people with schooling have been taught that learning is taking a test and regurgitating what you know. And that's not what we know about learning. Learning is communal. Learning is trying to make sense of the world around you, and for a lot of people, talking about it with other people. And so it's, for me, a way of saying you don't have to just take a test in order to show that you're learning something. You can talk to people about it. And so that's just where I think this is a really special opportunity.
One of the reason that I got into like using cosplay for science and teaching is because I was tired of learning things only in my PhD, and I'm like, I'm just gonna go learn about things on the internet. I'm gonna Google things until I feel like I can explain it well enough to someone else. And that's actually usually a goal or I would like it to be a goal in traditional K-12 schooling, but it often is not, because you're just performing for a test. But I feel like I retained so much more of what I learned when it was something that I was personally interested in, and I was sharing it with other people, just on like a blog, and because I was motivated to do that. And that was when I saw like all of the learning theories that I was being taught in formal schooling, like actually coming to life more so than I was just learning about it in a classroom. And then a lot of the things that we learn, like we learn how to speak to each other, we learn how to interact with each other before we even get, well, maybe in preschool, but we learn it from our families. We learn just being at home, and we learn on fandom forums. Like a professor at the university I was at literally studied people discussing Game of Thrones theories and like how they use practices that actual historians use. So it's not just science, it's also like history and all of that critical thinking and questioning and citing your sources and like, do we trust this source? And all of that kind of, those practices happening in a community online, and people learning new things about their favorite fandoms. All of that learning happens online, and not just in a classroom, but it happens, again, with other people, and when you're motivated to learn that thing and to share it with other people.
Speaking about going more into learning, I think it's one of the things that we try our best to do, and it's inherent in what we do, is the incorporation of art, right? STEAM in general, science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. And with our cosplay, we bring in that artistry, also utilizing the storytelling element of whatever fandom we're in. We really weave all those together as part of our methodology in Cosplay for Science to make science that much more approachable, to make it something that folks can find themselves immersed in. So for all of you, how how important do you think it is that we bring more art, combine more art with science outside of even Comic-Con into the greater scientific community and science communication? Getting more scientists to think about that.
I think it's yeah, there we go. That's a little better. I think it's incredibly important, and I have a particular soapbox that I have an unusual background, and my bachelor's degree is in English, and I have a particular soapbox that I really think more scientists need training in the humanities. In terms of like critical thinking, reading literature. I really am grateful that I had that time to be steeped in that other discipline, because there is this kind of idea that these are separate disciplines. Like you're either a science person or you're an art person. And I know so many scientists who have incredibly dedicated and amazing art practices. And I think incorporating that in any way that you can is actually pretty valuable. And we were talking earlier about the work that the ALF Museum has done with artists. They are people who are trained to use science to bring these beautiful prehistoric landscapes to life. You need art to do that. And so it's impossible to, I think it's actually truly impossible to separate science and art. You need both.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that and agree with that. And sometimes you get chuckles from people when you say STEAM instead of STEM, and they're like, "Why is art in there?" But art is visual learning. So if we're talking about learning, so many of us are visual learners, and so you have to have that aspect of art in order to learn science at all. And so yeah, I think that but I know so many artists that are very valuable members of the scientific community, even if they paint most of the time. That still can be science.
Sure. I think it's incredibly important, and it helps people also find really niche areas that maybe they wouldn't have considered beforehand. So for example, there is art restoration. But one of the key things with art restoration that you have to consider is if you're restoring it and you want it to be true to how the painting or whatever it was back in the time, you might want to consider what materials they had. And one of the ways you can do that to really check it is you can actually analyze the art, find out what they used, what trace metals were there, what kind of pigments did that result in. And that is just right there, a melding of history, of art, and it's also science and chemistry right there. So there are so many areas of research, of study, of career paths that you can take, and to just separate things, it's like you can just do this. It really limits people, or there's let's take it a step further, sound space design. Somebody had to consider a room, somebody had to think about how to amplify voices so you could speak, or if you're in a concert hall, so you could hear music from every aspect. And there is a heavy amount of science and design. And if you have an appreciation of music, maybe you can then understand, well, how should the balance be so that you have the correct, balance of your higher notes, which are going to be at a shorter wavelength and therefore be perceived differently than your lower notes at that longer wavelength, which can travel further. There's a lot.
Kellen, this depends on your opinion of what artistry is in art, but I love what you do with your food chemistry science too on social media, because those are two worlds where even though they're so connected to each other, folks are like, this is cooking and this is science, but it's they're one and the same.
Oh yeah, my personal favorite example is that if you take a look at pastries and desserts, at the end of the day, they're kind of all the same ingredients. There's your butter, your sugar, your flour. That's all you need. Yeah. But you can get vastly different textures, from your soft cookies to your fluffy cakes to maybe your many layers to a croissant, by just changing the order you add them in and the duration. And there is, that's science, that's chemistry, that's scientific method, testing and deciding which order gets you the process, what process gets you the result that you want. There's just so many ways to approach any kind of creative aspect of life with science and vice versa.
I can't talk about croissants right now.
Sorry.
I'm way too hungry.
Also just looking at cosplay. Cosplay itself is a whole science meets art, right? There's so much engineering that goes into creating a cosplay, like sewing, planning out where the stitches would, I don't sew, so I'm just saying things, but like, you know, planning that out, and like even the more complicated, like really cool mecha suits with like glowing LEDs, that's engineering, getting the wings to like pop open, and you know, the paint colors and all that stuff. There's so much science and critical thinking and experimentation that goes into creating even some of the most simple and beautiful cosplays. That's science right there. So for all the cosplayers out there, you know, you're a scientist in my opinion. I mean, sure, I just put on a coat today, but go ahead.
I think the importance of also like replicating your results is something we talk about in science a lot. Of like, if I follow these steps, will it always produce the same result? And you kind of want to do the same thing if you're a cosplayer or you're selling aspects of your cosplay, and I want to make sure I have like a consistent product that I can sell. If I am making wings for other people to use, can I make my process of creating that more efficient and like test out different ways or different materials of, can I improve this in a certain way? And again, you're doing that science, you're making a hypothesis, you're testing it, getting some data and figuring out, oh, does that actually match what my expectation is? Or can I go back to the drawing board and test out a different variable and see how that's going to affect my output later down the line? So it's all that scientific method in the creation process.
All right, so last question before we get to Q&A. Part of Cosplay for Science is we think it's very important to provide opportunities where audiences can actually engage with a scientist. That's an opportunity not available to so many people, right? Even if you go to a museum, the chances of you actually meeting face-to-face with a researcher, an active scientist, is so incredibly rare. But when we come to these cons, we provide our audiences the ability to actually talk to us, meet us, ask us those burning questions you've always wanted to know. And while yes, Google, learning how to look things up is an important tool, I feel like there's nothing better than asking those questions to the people who study them, because we can give a whole different insight than what Google can offer sometimes. So for all of you, how important do you think it is that we make ourselves available to our audiences, to meet us, to get to know a scientist?
I mean, I think it's incredibly important because I didn't personally meet a scientist until I was in my 20s. You know, I had grown up, when I was little, saw Jurassic Park, like every other 6-year-old who saw Jurassic Park. I was like, I want to be a paleontologist. And then I fell out of it because I had never met anybody who actually held that job. I'd never met a scientist. That's not like my economic or cultural background. I didn't know anybody. I didn't even know what the process was to get a PhD until, again, in my 20s. And so I don't know if, you know, maybe I would have gotten into the field earlier if I'd met a scientist earlier. And now, you know, I meet scientists every day. I am one, but that's not an opportunity that was available to me. And I think it's incredibly important because if people don't see it, they don't always know that they can be it. And so meeting a scientist can just be really impactful. I mean, for us, this is like, I think it's very easy to fall into a trap of like feeling like it's your everyday. And then you come here or you go to other places and you realize not everybody has the same opportunities that you have. And it's a really nice gut check. And so I think it's incredibly important to come to events like this, as for Cosplay for Science, in a very approachable manner and be like, hi, we're just like you. And just, you know, allow people to ask us questions, to see what we do, get very familiar with our work, because, you know, they might, one, at the very least, come away with a better understanding of science as a whole, but also, you know, you don't know how you're going to affect somebody else's life. And so they could be like, maybe this is something that I want to do one day. So personally, I do, find it incredibly impactful and important.
I'll add that talking to scientists, when you talk to someone who like really studies the field or just has a passion for it, it makes it so much more alive, so much more engaging. And I'll also add it gives you a new perspective. And one of the, obviously expanding new perspectives is important, but one of the reasons I think that's extra important is because yes, there's Google, but if you don't know how to ask the question, you won't get the answer that you need. And that's one of the things that in my learning, I have realized is the most important is I can go to someone with a question, but if I don't ask it the right way, I'm not gonna get this answer that's gonna help me. And having someone there to actually have a discussion with and, you know, see it from their perspective, I have found that to be way more useful. And they're, you know, usually I'm asking X and they're over here being like, you are just in a totally wrong plane. I'm like, oh, thank you for explaining this to me. So yeah, I think it's so important.
I think it's also special that we get to interact with people kind of one-on-one when we come to Comic-Cons. Like even in a science classroom, if you have a biology teacher, it's 20 or 30 or 40 students with one authority scientist, and you don't necessarily feel comfortable asking your questions in that kind of environment. Or even if you have like a virtual talk or something like that, which thankfully COVID has made more available, you still don't get that like one-on-one attention. You're still maybe likely in a large group being able to interact with a scientist. But coming to events like these, we get at like our booths or after a panel like this, we can have one-on-one conversations, get to know you as a person. And a big part of learning is trying to figure out what do you already know and how can I connect the new information that you're looking for to what you already know, and how might that change the kinds of information that you already know. If it's like restructuring, oh, I didn't know what a satellite was, because apparently that's the name for a moon, which I didn't even know. I'm like, oh, it's just a moon. Moons are moons, but moons are different from planets, and a satellite is different, or is a different category of those. But I had to like reorganize my understanding of astronomy when I got to like ask an astronomer, oh, what is a moon? And like, if you Google that, you're gonna get a very technical answer that's not super helpful and isn't catered to what you know already and what you don't know already.
Yeah, there's a lot of barriers to education in general, and there's a lot of ways that people are kind of trying to tackle that. There's obviously socioeconomic barriers to education, and that has implications along racial lines and gender lines. And there's not one answer to solve that. It's a very complicated problem that seems to be getting worse in a lot of parts of this country and the world in general. And I think that's one of the value, and I think that it's one of the ways that informal educators, such as, although some of Cosplay for Science is very formal educators, but informal education events sort of tries to tackle that problem and tries to stop that from happening and tries to make education more equitable and accessible to everyone. And there's no perfect way to do that or one way to do that. But I think informal education is a way to kind of tear those barriers down without, in settings that are like this Comic-Con.
I mean, yeah, for me too, it's just something as simple as representation, right? Like getting to be at a panel or representing a scientist on the convention floor. For me, growing up as a Filipino American, like I had never seen a Filipino scientist until I was in my 20s, right? I rarely got to see a brown scientist in any media, and let alone just amazing women scientists, and so many ways that we can represent and just be here, that someone can look and see themselves and be like, maybe I could do that too. I think one of my favorite interactions I ever had was, I was talking with this kid. I didn't really make anything of it. He just had so many questions. He's like, thank you, and he ran off. And like half an hour later, he came back. He's like, are you Filipino? And I was like, yeah. He's like, I never met a Filipino scientist. And he looks at his mom, he's like me. And then he ran away, and I swear I almost bawled my eyes out right there on the commission board. But it was a special moment to say, like, being there and talking with somebody, that does so much more. That does so many wonders than you can imagine. And so I think it's really important that we're here, we can represent, and we can, again, engage one-on-one. So, that about does it for our panel. We have time for a couple questions. And also I want to say, before we go, we have our Cosplay for Science pop-up museum down on the convention floor. We're at booth 549. We'll be there all day, so if you have more questions, we're there to answer it. And stick around, because right after this, we have our Pokemon, Natural History, and You panel, where we get to do everything we had just talked about. So are there any questions right now for anybody?
I love your Umbreon hat.
That is great. It's cute.
No? Okay.
Well, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Not the audience necessarily, I guess like the other panelists. I'm just wondering, so this is all about storytelling and cosplay and in science. So I'm wondering if any of us have had like a really effective experience, like feeling like this was something that I did that worked really well? Like, what was a really memorable experience of like science and storytelling that you've had in cosplaying?
Besides the one I just said, there was another one. We did a panel at, I think it was LA Comic-Con also, but it was a few years ago. And we were asking the audience to tell a story where, you know, they thought about science and some pop culture thing they liked, and everyone had fun doing it. And then afterward, this teenager in high school came and talked to me. He's like, hey, I just want to say thank you, because like, I never thought I liked science. I never thought I was good at chemistry and things like that. But then I was talking about how much I love Full Metal Alchemist, and he was like, that's like chemistry, isn't it? I was like, yeah, tell me the alchemical formula for a human being. And he was like, this part carbon, and blah, blah, blah. I was like, you just named a ton of elements from the periodic table. You know chemistry. You just know it in the form of an anime, which is even cooler. And that was probably my favorite way. We got to help someone make a connection to science that they thought they didn't have.
Yeah, I was there for that panel. It was so cool you asked people if they could around what they were wearing, but otherwise just, you know, their favorite. And I remember someone had like, I think a bee costume or something, and so we were, you know, talking about bees and the science of, you know, how they communicate. And did you know bees can do math? And I'm not making that up. They can. There is a study about, you know, they give bees pictures of shapes and different shapes, and they can differentiate between which is the great. It's very cool. Yeah, no, it was super effective, and just to suddenly see everybody talking amongst themselves was awesome. Total highlight.
Anyone else?
There is one other aspect to science of storytelling that I've been thinking about, which is just how you can bring storytelling to your science. Sometimes if you are in a very technical area, regardless if it's science or, you know, just your personal work in general, and you want to talk about it to someone, and you might think like, oh, I just don't have a way to make this interesting. And I promise you, there is a way to make it interesting. And what's funny is that when you know, some people call it the elevator pitch, some people, you know, they call it all other things, is when you talk about your research or your science or just something that you're interested in, you actually present it in the exact same way, and Sarah said this earlier, as the hero's journey, where you start with the conditions and how things are, you talk about the thing that, you know, what needs to change, you talk about how you do that, and then like the end result, and that's like it's the exact same path. And so you can bring storytelling to your research, to whatever it is you want to communicate. So it almost like goes both ways. You know, we can show how there's science in stories that you love, but then also we can show how stories can help you be a better communicator of science or whatever it is that you want to talk about.
All right, that does it for our panel. Thank you so much for everybody for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Please find us on social media at Cosplay for Science, and please visit our pop-up museum. We're happy to talk to you more. And like I said, right after this, we have our Pokemon Natural History and You panel. Thanks everybody. A round of applause for an amazing panel.